Can a single coordinates error unlock a dark secret in 100 days at sea? What if staying on this island reveals the unthinkable? If you leave now, you'll miss the shocking truth that's been hidden in plain sight, and the consequences that come with it. What happens when a player discovers a set of coordinates that don't belong to any known location in 100 days at sea, yet somehow still loads an unmarked island, and what does this reveal about the game's supposed boundaries? The story begins with a player named Erebus_Voyager, who stumbled upon a peculiar set of coordinates while digging through the game's files. The coordinates, 43.7232, 12.4567, didn't seem to match any known location in the game. Yet, when Erebus_Voyager decided to test them, the game surprisingly loaded an unmarked island. The island was small, with a few palm trees and a strange, glowing rock in the center. As Erebus_Voyager explored the island, they noticed that the game's usual survival mechanics didn't apply: no hunger, no thirst, and no fatigue. It was as if the island existed outside of the game's normal rules. But what was even more bizarre was the presence of a small, cryptic message etched into the rock: "The eyes that see are not the ones that look." The message was dated the 15th of February, 2022, which happens to be the exact date when the game's developers posted a mysterious tweet with a similar phrase. Furthermore, the island's terrain seemed to shift and change every time Erebus_Voyager visited, with new paths and new objects appearing out of nowhere. The most striking detail, however, was the discovery of a hidden log file on the island, which contained a series of cryptic entries from an unknown player, each entry detailing a different experiment conducted on the island. The entries were dated from either 1st of January 2020 to either 14th of February 2022, and they seemed to describe some kind of twisted psychological test. As Erebus_Voyager delved deeper into the log file, they began to notice a pattern: each experiment seemed to be designed to manipulate the player's perception of reality. And then, there was the strange occurrence of the 15th of February 2022, when the log file suddenly stopped, and the island's terrain changed dramatically. It was as if something had been unleashed, or awakened, on that exact date. The investigation is just beginning, but one thing is certain: this island is not what it seems, and the truth behind its existence will challenge everything we thought we knew about 100 days at sea. How do the island's ever-changing paths and objects relate to the game's supposed procedural generation, and what does this imply about the true nature of the game's world? As Erebus_Voyager continued to explore the island, they began to notice that the terrain was shifting and changing in ways that defied explanation. New paths would appear, old ones would disappear, and objects would move or change shape before their eyes. At first, it seemed like a glitch, but as the changes continued, Erebus_Voyager started to suspect that something more sinister was at play. The game's procedural generation system, which was supposed to create a unique and dynamic world, seemed to be working in tandem with the island's strange properties. But how, and why? The answer lay in the game's code, where Erebus_Voyager discovered a series of hidden variables and functions that seemed to be controlling the island's terrain. The variables were labeled island_seed, terrain_shift, and the object_rotation, and they seemed to be linked to the game's internal clock and the player's actions. As Erebus_Voyager dug deeper, they found that the variables were being manipulated by an unknown entity, which was using the game's procedural generation system to create an ever-changing maze. The entity, which Erebus_Voyager dubbed the Architect, seemed to be toying with the player, creating an environment that was both fascinating and terrifying. But what was the Architect's ultimate goal, and how did it relate to the game's mysterious Day 100th event? The investigation led Erebus_Voyager to a hidden forum, where a group of players were discussing their own experiences with the island. They had all stumbled upon the island, just like Erebus_Voyager, and they had all noticed the strange terrain shifts. But they had also noticed something else: a series of strange, unmarked events that seemed to occur on the island, always at exactly 3:33 a.m. The events were described as visions or hallucinations, and they seemed to be linked to the game's internal clock and the player's actions. As Erebus_Voyager read through the forum posts, they began to realize that the island was not just a simple glitch or a procedural generation anomaly, it was a doorway to a much larger, much stranger world. What do the cryptic messages and log entries on the island reveal about the true purpose of the game, and how do they relate to the mysterious eyes that seem to be watching the player? The cryptic messages and log entries on the island seem to be pointing to a deeper truth about the game. The phrase, "the eyes that see are not the ones that look," was repeated throughout the log file, and it seemed to be linked to the game's internal mechanics. Erebus_Voyager discovered that the phrase was actually a reference to an old psychological concept, which suggested that our perception of reality is not always based on what we see, but rather on what we expect to see. The game, it seemed, was manipulating the player's perception of reality, using the island's shifting terrain and the cryptic messages to create a sense of unease and disorientation. But why? The answer lay in the game's code, where Erebus_Voyager found a series of hidden functions and variables that seemed to be controlling the player's perception of the game world. The functions were labeled a perception_shift, reality_distortion, and I_the_beholder, and they seemed to be linked to the game's internal clock and the player's actions. As Erebus_Voyager dug deeper, they found that the functions were being manipulated by the architect, which was using the game's mechanics to create a sense of psychological unease. The architect, it seemed, was not just a simple entity, it was a representation of the game's true purpose, which was to manipulate the player's perception of reality. But what was the ultimate goal of this manipulation, and how did it relate to the game's mysterious Day 100 event? The investigation led Erebus_Voyager to a hidden website, where a group of players were discussing their own experiences with the game's psychological manipulation. They had all noticed the strange, unmarked events that seemed to occur on the island, and they had all realized that the game was not just a simple survival game, it was a psychological experiment. As Erebus_Voyager read through the website, they began to realize that the game was not just manipulating the player's perception of reality, it was also manipulating their emotions, their thoughts, and their actions. The game, it seemed, was a tool for social engineering, designed to manipulate the player's behavior and create a sense of dependence. But who was behind this manipulation, and what was their ultimate goal? What is the true purpose of the game, and how does it relate to the mysterious architect that seems to be manipulating the player's perception of reality? The investigation led Erebus_Voyager to a shocking revelation: the game was not just a simple survival game, but a tool for social engineering, designed to manipulate the player's behavior and create a sense of dependence. The architect, it seemed, was not just a simple entity, it was a representation of the game's true purpose, which was to manipulate the player's perception of reality. But who was behind this manipulation, and what was their ultimate goal? The answer lay in the game's code, where Erebus_Voyager found a series of hidden functions and variables that seemed to be controlling the game's mechanics. The functions were labeled behavior_manipulation, dependence_creation, and social_engineering, and they seemed to be linked to the game's internal clock and the player's actions. As Erebus_Voyager dug deeper, they found that the functions were being manipulated by a group of unknown individuals, who were using the game to conduct a large-scale psychological experiment. The experiment, it seemed, was designed to test the limits of human psychology and to create a sense of dependence and manipulation. But what was the ultimate goal of this experiment, and how did it relate to the game's mysterious Day 100 event? The investigation led Erebus_Voyager to a shocking conclusion: the game was not just a game, but a tool for mind control, designed to manipulate the player's behavior and create a sense of dependence. The architect, it seemed, was not just a simple entity, it was a representation of the game's true purpose, which was to control the player's mind. As Erebus_Voyager reflected on their investigation, they realized that the game was not just a simple survival game, it was a doorway to a much larger, much stranger world. And the truth behind this world was more shocking than they could have ever imagined. The truth behind 100 Days at Sea is more sinister than we could have ever imagined. The game is not just a game, but a tool for social engineering, designed to manipulate the player's behavior and create a sense of dependence. The architect, it seems, is not just a simple entity, it is a representation of the game's true purpose, which is to control the player's mind. This was not just a glitch or a procedural generation anomaly, it was a deliberate design choice, made by the game's developers to create a sense of unease and disorientation. The devs know exactly what they did, and they're using the game to conduct a large-scale psychological experiment. The ultimate goal of this experiment is still unknown, but one thing is certain: the truth behind 100 Days at Sea will change the way we think about games forever. And there's no way that's a coincidence, the devs know exactly what they did.